Welcome. We'll get started in just a moment.
Bienvenidos, vamos a estar comenzando nomás en un momentito.
So welcome. Thank you for joining this Zoom for a discussion of conservation transactions and creative funding. My name is Melanie Schlotterbeck, and I'll be moderating this session today for Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks. You'll see we are in webinar format on a Zoom platform, and this means the icons at the bottom of your screen may look a little different than you normally see. Today's content is being live simulcast in Spanish, and now our interpreter will translate this introduction before being moved into the Spanish audio channel.
Bienvenidos, gracias por unirse a este Zoom para una discusión sobre transacciones de conversación y financiación creativa. Mi nombre es Melanie Schlotterbeck y moderaré esta sesión hoy para Friends of Harbors, Beaches and Parks. Verá que estamos en formato de seminario web en la plataforma de Zoom. Esto significa que los iconos en la parte inferior pueden ser un poco diferentes de lo que normalmente ve. El contenido de hoy se está transmitiendo simultáneamente en vivo al español y ahora nuestra intérprete, que soy yo, Mercedes, traducirá esta introducción antes de pasar el canal de audio en español.
So every slide has yellow text to match the English version of content.
Bueno, entonces cada diapositiva tiene texto amarillo para que coincida con la versión en inglés del contenido.
And should you need interpretation services, please click on the globe icon and select Spanish.
Si fuera a necesitar servicios de interpretación, por favor haga clic en el icono del globo terráqueo y seleccione español. Muchísimas gracias.
Should you need assistance with closed captioning, that is offered as well. Simply click the show captions icon. During today's presentation, we will be accepting questions via the Q&A icon. If you click on it, you have the option to ask a question by typing into the box. Selecting it allows you to type your question in, be anonymous, and click the send arrow on the bottom right. Finally, limited interactions will occur during the Zoom in the chat, as it is only being used to pass information on to our participants. If you need to send us something, click here on the chat icon and type your message, then click send. Please direct all questions to the panelists through the Q&A feature. Today's event is being recorded and will be posted to the Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks YouTube channel. If you miss any portion, need to see something again, or registered but couldn't make it, this entire workshop will be available online. And now that we have the basics out of the way, let me acknowledge that the state of California exists on occupied territory of over 110 federally recognized and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. These lands have been stewarded by Native nations since time immemorial. These lands and waters have significance to the indigenous people of California. Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks work is focused on the ancestral homelands of the Ahachiman, Juanino, and Tongva Gabrielino people. We pay respect to the indigenous people whose land was forcibly colonized and recognize the importance of the tribal relationship to the land, past, present, and future. Today's workshop is brought to you by the nonprofit Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks, or FHBP for short. We work to protect the natural lands, waterways, and beaches of Orange County, California, and we are grateful for the grant funding that allowed these workshops to be made available. FHBP's team working on this webinar includes myself as the moderator. We also have Mercedes Merlot as our interpreter and Giovanni DeFranco, who is staffing the chat and Q&A. This series is in partnership with the statewide Power and Nature Coalition, which coordinates grassroots efforts for 30 by 30. And if you've not heard of 30 by 30, that initiative, I'm going to give you a little primer. Governor Newsom signed Executive Order N82-20, which set a goal to protect 30% of California's lands and waters by 2030, and it's shortened to 30 by 30. It isn't just a California effort, it's a local, state, national, and international effort. And the agency responsible for overseeing the implementation of 30 by 30 is the California Natural Resources Agency, or CNRA. There are 3 pillars to 30 by 30, which include biodiversity, access to nature, and climate resilience. CNRA released on Earth Day, April 22nd, last year, a document called Pathways to 30 by 30, which identified 10 different strategies on how we will achieve 30 by 30. To achieve 30 by 30, organizations like yours will likely be advancing projects for consideration by funding agencies. That's why today we're going to cover the nuts and bolts of conservation deals and funding mechanisms. We are grateful to have with us today experts in their field focusing on this important material. First is Paolo Peroni. He's a project director working with the statewide Nature Conservancy, rather it's California Nature Conservancy, as opposed to the international organization. He primarily conducts land acquisition for large landscape scale conservation and supports efforts to expand access to public lands, generate funding for parks and open space, and assist partner organizations in their conservation efforts. Paolo previously worked as the Southern California Conservation Fellow for the Trust for Public Land and as a consultant for a variety of mitigation and conservation projects. Next is Nicole Padron. Nicole is the co-executive director of the Rivers and Lands Conservancy, RLC, overseeing the organization's acquisition and stewardship programs. Joining the staff as a land steward in 2013, Nicole managed RLC's conserved lands to ensure protection of their conservation values. As stewardship director, Nicole managed RLC's increasing conservation lands portfolio and conducted due diligence, evaluation, budgeting, and legal document review of proposed acquisition properties, including those to be conserved through mitigation. Our third presenter is Edwin Sauls. Ed is the president of the Sauls Company and the CEO of the California Land Conservancy. And since 1979, his land use, development, and environmental expertise has resulted in more than 100 financially successful community-supported development projects and 89,000 acres of wildlife conservation in Southern California. He's developed a wide range of residential, mixed use, and industrial projects in Southern California, and he has successfully negotiated approvals for 5 of SoCal's habitat conservation plans, sponsored state and federal environmental legislation, testified to the US Congress and California legislature, and completed 4 state and federal conservation banks. Last but certainly not least is Terrell Terry is an expert land use planner focused on projects that deliver climate resilient solutions in the area of housing and community development, renewable energy, and conservation. She's a skilled facilitator and works closely with clients to bring workable, transformative approaches to pressing challenges. Professional memberships include Lambda Alpha International, the American Planning Association, and the American Institute of Certified Planners. She's also a board member with the Tejon Ranch Conservancy and a former board member of the Planning and Conservation League, Tahoe Fund, and Santa Lucia Conservancy. We're delighted to have these four presenters with us today. Each presentation topic will have about 10 minutes to cover their material and answer a few questions after that. We encourage you to add your questions into the Q&A window so that we can track them there. We anticipate plenty of time at the end for questions as well, so don't be disheartened if your question isn't answered immediately. So first up is Paolo walking us through transaction basics. These are the details of actually getting a deal done. Paolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melanie. And again, my name is Paolo Peroni, and I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and I also work with the Banning Ranch Conservancy on their board of directors. So thank you for having me here today. So I'm going to focus on some higher level components of conservation land transactions, and it's a very technical process. It is a real estate deal at its core. But I think what I really want to get into today is the fact that these are multi-year partner management exercises. There are dozens of partners, primary, secondary, tertiary, in these land deals, but the specifics of each one will be quite variable, but the process of engaging those partners, I think, is something we can put some frameworks in place to be successful. So, and just a quick note on the Simpsons graphics here, you'll see a few of them. It was the first graphic that I was able to Google, and they have an image for everything. So that's why you're going to see a few of them here. So I think what we're going to focus on here is really going to set us up for project success. It's all about your personal well-being as well, and it's about relationships that are going to be successful for future projects as well as future actions on projects that you may acquire, so restoration as well. But the first thing I want to talk about is making a transition to an effective partner. And I think there's a lot of projects that come about as opposition to development projects or opposition to a specific land use, and the sort of baseline mood, the baseline effort is usually adversarial, right? So it's stop the development, sue the developer using CEQA, demand action on climate. And those are all, important parts of a bigger process to creating the opportunity for a conservation transaction, but they don't necessarily serve us in getting to a place where we can work with willing sellers, we can work with partners to actually effectuate a real successful land transaction deal that permanently protects that property. So we're trying to get to that place where, again, we're all partners and working towards this shared vision of a conserved property. And so just as a couple examples, this will come up, externally, you're going to have partners demanding, action immediately and fighting, right? And it will come internally, even sometimes in your own marketing departments, they're going to want to have stories about a fight, that gets you people riled up and amped up to, really push the project in a way that's, catchy and media splashy, and that's that fight, kind of component. And I will just make a note here for those that do know The Simpsons, on that second graphic with the rainbow and the sun, that's the attorney Lionel Hutz, and you'll see he's very much not happy that everybody's getting along, and that's kind of a good little lesson in that slide there. So what do sort of adversaries and partners have that are different and serve these processes in different ways, right? So adversaries are energetic, right? It's really about a fight to stop a development, a fight to push through a specific sort of outcome. It's exhilarating, It's what gets you likes and retweets. It gets, calls, a lot of small donations. It's emotional. And it really kind of brings people into this sphere. And again, an important part of these land transactions, but very difficult to transition from that sort of mode into a partner mode, which gets you all of the components you need to really effectuate these complex real estate deals, to preserve properties, to get to this larger 30 by 30 effort. And so partners are pragmatic. They can be boring. It means a lot of meetings. It means a lot of negotiations. It means a lot of compromise. It means a lot of empathy. I think that is a word I can't stress enough, right? And so, that is something that's much harder to sell. I can just give you an example. My own marketing department, when I was at the Trust for Public Land, really wanted to put out a press release that said, tell Governor Newsom to stand with us in the fight against an oil company. And I said, we're not fighting that oil company. We're actually in partnership with that oil company to preserve Southern California's last remaining privately owned wetland complex. And that was a conversation that kind of ruffled some feathers. It was a difficult conversation to kind of move internally from that, adversarial mindset that gets those clicks, that gets those likes, that gets those donations, to, hey, we're working with this group and they're working with us and they're putting their best foot forward. And so part of that process is focusing inward to understand your partners. And the first thing I always let people know and push them towards is understanding who they work for, right? And who do they really work for, right? They have bosses, they have larger organizations, they have investor groups. And so you need to kind of, through conversations, through research, understand what does success look like for the other side? Is it financial? Is it political? Is it getting out of a bad narrative that's developed in the press, maybe from that first adversarial sort of process that maybe stopped the development and created the opportunity to pursue a conservation transaction? Those are all things you want to ask yourself, because again, you're trying to make a friend here. You're trying to have someone that's going to work with you over multiple years. And I can't stress that these are multiple year processes. And going back to that first slide, this is for your success, but this is also for your mental health, for your just day-to-day well-being and getting through this, because they're hard. And it's going to be, just something you're going to have to work through day in, day out. So who do they work for, but also where are they coming from? What's their family life like? What's their background? What's, what are components of their identity? Again, there's that trope, right? We spend more of our lives at work than we do with, our family sometimes, right? And there are people in transactions I've worked on where I'm meeting with them for multiple hours, 5 days a week, much more than I would, see multiple members of my family on, extended family, for example. And so understanding where people are coming from is really important. And then showing that you understand where they're coming from, and not just sort of saying like, hey, you're over here and I'm over here, let's see what we can do, and butt heads as much as possible. And one thing that I found extremely helpful is usually you're working with multiple different people, so build relationships at different levels. So when one relationship starts to fray, maybe it's the two principals, maybe it's the director of your organization and the director of another organization, whether it be a landowner or for example a funding agency. They have certain things they need to hash out and certain postures that may be taken. Maybe you or someone on your team can forge a relationship with somebody else at a lower level or a different place where you can go keep that relationship moving forward without necessarily letting that butting of heads at the top level kind of sour things below. So understand who you're working with, and make sure there's multiple different relationships made so that you can tap those as things maybe hit rough patches, right? And so here are kind of a few of the primary partners that you work with on any conservation land transaction. You've got your funders, right? Where does the money come from? You've got your long-term stewards. This may be the organization you're working with. If you're a land trust, it may be somebody else. It may be a government agency like a county park, or a federal agency like the Park Service or the Forest Service. And you've got your title holder who actually owns the property. And this could be a very diverse array of people. It could be a company, it could be a company with shareholders. So again, understanding who those people are and where they're coming from is very important. I think what I'd like to stress, looking at this, particular slide here and this sort of constellation, to get back to that original analogy here, is that the demands may change over time. You may have a really tough time with your title holder in the beginning in negotiations. And then as you move into the funding phase, you may find that your funders and your environmental organizations that are your stewards may become more difficult. They were on your side in the fight, right? They're from the environmental community. But now they're looking at a project and saying, I have to get X, Y, and Z out of it. And that becomes a negotiation and maybe, pretty sticky. And in some of the deals I've worked with, wouldn't have guessed that I would, come out very close with an appraiser or developer, but, funding agencies, maybe the relationship wasn't so great, because we just had different ideas and different outcomes, successful, but tough, right? And, who you thought would be the toughest relationship is something that can change over time. And then again, don't forget all the other partners. So I love this picture here. I don't know how they crammed all those Simpsons characters onto one slide, but you've got appraisers, environmental consultants, media, tribal leaders, community groups, photographers, biologists, geologists, elected officials. That should be a whole other presentation there. Regulators, surveyors, event planners, academic institutions, other non-governmental organizations, the people that run that coffee shop right down the street from your property that you have dozens of meetings at, the bartenders that you get drinks with, the title holders after very tenuous meetings, therapists, good friends, pets and family, all the people that wind you down after these tense negotiations and these tense projects. So to wrap this up, and again, I'm happy to answer as many questions as possible. I just want to stress it's a long process, and it really takes transitioning from that fight mode into that partner mode. And that takes a lot of internal reflection, and it takes a lot of empathy for the people you're working with. And they don't necessarily come from the community you work in, from the community that you grew up in, or the community that you're used to working with. So I think just want to stress that internal reflection and that seeking of relationships over that short-term win of that adversarial sort of process that plays out so often in our environmental community.
Thank you, Paulo. That was very fun to watch the integration of The Simpsons. I do have a couple questions. I will remind the audience that if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. One early question is, because of that fight mode that nonprofits and community groups tend to be in to get a transaction to the place of bringing in an entity like TPL or the Nature Conservancy or others, how do you actually need to reframe this in your head to go from adversary to partner? I mean, you're no longer in fight mode. What do you need to, how do you need to think of things differently?
I think keeping in mind the end goal is very important. Going to the land, seeing the specific place, creating relationships with other partners that give you the inspiration to move forward through those tough times. And that, is to say that it takes both reacting to partnerships, right? Like people will come to you with different ideas, and it also means seeking out those that can kind of help make a positive light on all of this. And, I think in particular, public funders and to a very large degree, your title holders who in 99 out of 100 conservation projects need to be willing sellers. There's an exception to the rule, but let's just say, they need to be willing sellers. The government wants to fund things, but they've got a lot of red tape that they need to go through. Folks want to see a positive project. They want to hear why this is going to move things forward. And if we get stuck in the weeds on what is holding everything up and why the project is fraught, it does kind of push people away. So I think going to that land, feeling the inspiration of why you're doing it, and seeking out those partners that sort of provide a little bit more background as to why it's important to community. That's always helped me sort of shift from that sort of adversarial to that partner role.
Great. One question that's come in on the Q&A is, do you ever cold call property owners, and how do you approach landowners? And this may also be appropriate, Ed, in the future for you, so we'll leave this question open.
100% yes. Yeah. So when I first started in this business a little over 15 years ago, the general plan of attack was getting, and here I said attack, right? Like that's where we start. It's just kind of the mindset, but getting addresses, sending letters. And so I would write a letter saying, I'm interested in your property. I am a buyer in a real estate transaction, like many others, unlike many others in a lot of ways. So yes, but in general, those, you know, are like at best, like 30% response rate and, you know, maybe 10% success, like 1 out of every 10 letters, you're actually gonna get a project done, if that. But it is something that I do advise, and that's your first contact. So maybe think about how you want to present yourself, and that's a good place to start as a partner, as opposed to, you know, you screwed up this whole property and I want to buy it from you, right?
Right. And kind of a follow-up question to that, we've received a comment in the chat, so I encourage everyone to go through the Q&A icon. The role of that conservation partner in a transaction, is there a place for them to continue to try to push the transaction forward? And I'm also going to tack on a second question about, do they get any access to information like a copy of the appraisal or the purchase and sale agreement? Where do you draw the boundary?
Yeah, I think it all depends, and it kind of depends on the nature of the adversarial relationship. If there's been lawsuits, if there's been a lot of animosity, there may be individuals that at a certain point don't necessarily bring a lot of benefit to the success, depending on how well they're able to transition out of that previous role into a partnership role. I think sharing as much as possible is great. There are probably going to be some delays where, you know, principals in a real estate transaction are going to want to agree that they've, you know, come to, for example, an appraisal they both agree upon. You're not going to want to necessarily share things before they're complete, or share things before everybody's agreed they want to move forward, because that could leave people in a worse situation for maybe the second attempt if the first one's not successful. But I think it's important that everybody is brought into the loop at a certain point and is involved in the overall outcome, maybe not at every step of the process. So it's something to be considered. You know, as I said in the beginning, each project's different, but I think transparency should be held as a high regard. And you know, just be thoughtful of, you know, people's emotions stemming from those previous maybe tense conflicted times, and how can you move forward, and what can move people out of those positions.
Great, thank you again, Paula. We'll go ahead and transition over to Nicole and her presentation. Keep dropping the questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end, or simply add them for Nicole if you have them during her presentation.
All right, good morning, everyone. And thank you to the Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks for inviting me to present today. I am Nicole Padron, and I am the co-executive director of the Rivers and Lands Conservancy. And today I'm going to talk about how land is preserved through mitigation transactions. We'll briefly cover what mitigation is, what mitigation transactions look like, at least from the perspective of a land trust. And we'll talk about why mitigation is an important form of land conservation. So first, what is mitigation? So the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, requires that governmental entities such as cities or counties consider the impacts of a development project before approval. And I'm saying impacts on the environment. So there are also regulatory agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Regional Water Quality Control Board that also review the project and conduct their own assessment of impacts based on their sphere of regulatory oversight. So when significant impacts are identified through the CEQA process or through regulatory review, those impacts must be avoided or mitigated, which is to say reduced. And land conservation is one form of mitigation. So here's a simplified example mitigation project. There was a road widening project in the county of Riverside to support additional traffic needs from a large commercial development. It required that a stream basically be rerouted. And through the CEQA process, an environmental impact report was prepared because significant impacts to the environment were identified and various mitigation measures were required in order to reduce the impacts of that project. So those mitigation measures included creating new stream bed, which you see in the photograph on the screen, restoring or enhancing habitat in the existing stream bed, and conserving the property in perpetuity through a conservation easement. So there are a few tools available to conserve land in perpetuity, and each of these tools is implemented through a written legal agreement recorded in public records, binding the owner to conserve the land. However, they do differ in their ability to protect land in perpetuity. One's a little stronger. So the first is the deed restriction, in which the landowner basically agrees to conserve the land. In this case, there's only one party to the agreement, which is the landowner. And while a regulatory agency or another party may have the right to enforce the requirements of the deed restriction, no one has the explicit duty to enforce those requirements. Now, the assurance that a deed restriction is upheld is increased if the property is transferred or owned by a nonprofit land trust or another entities whose purpose is to conserve and steward land. So a conservation easement, on the other hand, provides significantly more protection. Every conservation easement is granted by the owner to another authorized entity. Governmental entities, certain tribes, and nonprofit land trusts, such as the Rivers and Lands Conservancy, are qualified to hold conservation easements. And conservation easements are actually a preferred tool for mitigation transactions, which I'll explain here. So per the terms of the conservation easement, the easement holder has an explicit duty to monitor compliance with the easement's restrictions. So that means that somebody's responsible for visiting the property at least once per year to monitor the conditions. And if violations to the terms of the conservation easement are identified during monitoring, such as grading or dumping, the easement holder has a right to enforce the violation by any means necessary, including taking legal action. And the restrictions of an easement may differ from easement to easement, but generally the purpose of a conservation easement is to ensure that the land is conserved in an open space condition in perpetuity, so forever. And the rights of enforcement for the easement are also extended to third-party beneficiaries, which are some of those regulatory agencies I explained earlier, like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. However, they really rely on the easement holder to actually do the enforcement. So Rivers and Lands Conservancy, or RLC, plays a really important role in mitigation transactions. As a 501c3 nonprofit land trust, we're authorized to hold conservation easements in accordance with California Civil Code. We're also authorized on a project by project basis by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to specifically hold mitigation lands. We currently hold and manage over 1,600 acres of open space for mitigation purposes throughout Southern California, including Riverside, San Bernardino, Orange, and Imperial counties. We hold land that's conserved for endangered species habitat. We have land that's conserved for agricultural purposes and land that has wetland or riparian resources. We hold and manage over $15 million in endowment funds for perpetual monitoring and maintenance of those mitigation lands and other lands under our stewardship. And very importantly, we are accredited by the National Land Trust Alliance Accreditation Commission. And that means as an accredited land trust, we've undertaken a rigorous review and approval process, demonstrating that we have a fiscally accountable organization, an organization that has strong leadership by way of board of directors, that we do sound land transactions, and that we have lasting stewardship of the lands that we conserve, because we are in the business of conserving land in perpetuity forever. So because we're in that business, we review every potential mitigation project with scrutiny to ensure that any risks to the future conservation of the site are identified and reduced, and that adequate funding is budgeted and provided in order to uphold the conservation values of that site. So just to give you a little idea of the process, we have a two-phase process to consider mitigation for land for conservation. And during phase one, we review all of the project documents requiring the mitigation, including the regulatory permits, the long-term management plans, and we prepare a budget to determine the funding we would need for a perpetual non-wasting endowment. And then we would prepare a letter of intent that would be signed by us and the property owner, describing the terms in which we agree to the conservation easement. And during the second phase is when we would actually negotiate the easement and other legal documents in conjunction with our legal counsel and the property owner and the involved regulatory agencies. We conduct title review and we prepare a baseline documentation report. And this report basically describes all the conditions of the site at the time of acceptance. It is our evidence to show whether the site has changed, or if there's been a violation, how the site has changed from that baseline condition. So it's our evidence. And when everything is ready, we record the easement in the county the property resides in, and the project proponent or the developer will provide the endowment funding. They're actually required to provide long-term funding to manage the property for the regulatory permits. So to sum it up, land conservation through the mitigation process is important, and it really matters because land is protected from future development and threats by way of conservation easements held by land trusts. Long-term management is funded by the project proponent by way of a non-wasting endowment to ensure that the conservation values of the site are upheld forever. And the land trust actually ensures those purposes are upheld through regular monitoring and reporting. And land trusts have a legal right to enforce violations and require restoration of habitat should something get damaged, which altogether ensures that the property is protected forever as intended. And that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Nicole. We appreciate not only your work on this, but RLC's work, because I know you've been around for quite a while. There are a couple of questions that have come in specific to your presentation. One that's a really interesting one from Dennis is, can a conservation easement be removed? And if so, how and by whom?
That is a great question. So conservation easements can be removed. It's a challenging process. in the case that there's eminent domain, a conservation easement could be potentially removed. However, per the terms of the easement, some equal type of habitat would need to be conserved and placed under easement should that easement go away, but it's very challenging to remove a conservation easement.
Great, thank you. Leslie's asking a question about RLC having a preference in holding an easement, performing management, and managing the funds. Do you have any sites that you hold easements or manage, and have others where you simply manage the endowment funds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Rivers and Lands Conservancy has easements where we manage the fund, manage the site, and hold the easement. So we've performed all three roles. We have easements where we are just the easement holder, and so we're monitoring the site, but we're not actually doing the management. So we've done that as well, and we're open to that type of transaction. We also do not accept projects for which somebody else holds and manages the fund. So we want to have an endowment for and manage the endowment for every project we accept. And we don't typically take on the management of the endowment for other entities. It's just a little bit outside of our scope and mission as the land trust to manage funds on behalf of other entities.
Great. One last question before we move on to Ed from Barbara is, how do conservation easements held by a land trust interact with tribal sovereignty? Are there other options available?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. So that's a great question. It's something I'm willing to look up and look into, but yeah, I don't have an answer for that.
All right, thank you. Ed, I would like to welcome you to this morning's presentation. I'm hoping we all gain some better understanding through the landowner perspective. Go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you. Good morning. Nice to be with all of you, and my presentation will be, as Melanie suggested, trying to get some perspective from the landowner. This is building on Paolo's good presentation about the overall structure and the complexity and things like that. And we work a lot on the mitigation side as well, as Nicole has shared. But the first thing I think is important is to understand the how conservation sales are different from. Yeah, here we go. We need one more slide here to catch up. Here we go. How different conservation sales are from a landowner's normal business in real estate. As Paolo said, these are essentially still real estate transactions. And a lot of landowners, their real estate is maybe their home and another property. We run into this often. And so when or sometimes, many times, we have very sophisticated landowners, but even still, a conservation sale is extremely different. In terms of the timing of them, they do take years. The uncertainty of funding in a normal transaction, somebody qualifies up front for a loan and a down payment on a house or a property. In a conservation transaction, it's, well, look, we think we're going to get funding here, and if it doesn't, too bad, we'll work it out. So they're subject to government actions and decision making, even the deposits. So I did a little comparison one time about transactions in San Diego and Orange and Riverside County. And when you look at the initial deposit, there is either no initial deposit or it's completely refundable. And in a private transaction, a landowner expects, hey, at some point, you're going to complete an investigation of the property, and you'll look at it and decide you're going to move ahead. And at that point, you will have committed a certain amount of initial dollars to me as the landowner, that if you fail to purchase the property, at least I'll be compensated by that initial deposit. Not the case in a conservation deal. So it's real important. A landowner looks at it and says, wait a minute, you're going to tie up my property. I can't put it on the open market to bring in another buyer while you're messing around with it. And you're going to do this for how long with no real money commitment? Why are we doing this? So it's good to just kind of understand how different it is. Moving then into the complexity of these, the major point here is there is no one typical landowner, no one typical land parcel. And as a result of that, the transactions are varied immensely in how we structure it. It's kind of beyond our time today to talk about deal structures, but what you'll find is with the landowners, there's different motivations. Why are they talking to you? Are they talking to you because they tried to develop the property and couldn't? Are they here because it was an ownership that mom and dad bought years ago and they passed it on to us as heirs? And it's now time, we don't use the property, we don't appreciate it like mom and dad did, and it's time to move on. Who owns it? Is it large, small? Is it rural? Is it urban? How is the property owned? It makes a huge difference in how you approach it. Sometimes it's owned by a single individual. Sometimes it's owned by an LLC. Other times it's owned in tenants in common. And that's a very complex situation where multiple owners all have to agree. Any one small percentage owner could blow the transaction just because they don't want to sign on it. So that ownership is important to understand in this matrix that I'm talking about. As Nicole suggested, there's mitigation purchases, and then there's also there's conservation purchases vary considerably in how those things are done. And then the funding sources, maybe typically it's in mitigation, it may be a developer or a development project, could be government project or a private project that's impacting and needs to mitigate. Very different motivations. Other times it's a government acquisition from funding. And as I mentioned, even in their purchase and sale agreements, they're varied dramatically. So that complexity adds into how we try and conduct business with the landowner and the challenges presented to them in trying to get them to move into a conservation of their property. So the fundamentals, trust is the key. And I think in anything, I used to say that my business was resolving conflict between development and endangered species protection. And then I ultimately said, whatever that problem is, we try and describe it that way. It really is a people problem. And so knowing that, you need to know who your landowner is. As I mentioned, how they own it, but who's the decision maker in the process if there's multiple owners? Why do they want to conserve? What is their timing? What is their expectations? What do they think the property is valued at? How do you reach agreement on value? And we just try and go in with our experience and never underestimate the landowners. They're usually very, very knowledgeable. Sorry about the phone there. Just a second. Hotel rooms. So tips on approaching landowners. We almost always are referred to a situation. It's to have that, I have experience in trying to reach people individually and cold calling, if you will. It's a lot of work and very unfruitful. We're just very busy anyway with our normal situation is somebody has tried to deal with a government entity, or they have a land broker where they've already expressed an interest to sell, but it's just not moving because the anticipation is that it might be appropriate for development. And we bring to the table an alternative then of conserving the land instead of developing it or selling it as a ranch or something to that. And that's important to understand all throughout this process as a tip is, first of all, you do have to communicate with the landowner every step of the way. But in doing that, one of the things we try and always bring back into focus is how is the conservation of the property compare as an alternative to their other sources? Could they sell it on the open market? Could they develop the property? How does that work? Well, sometimes we're here because it didn't work. And we always have to bring that perspective, helps them focus in on moving ahead with the transaction. Communicating, understanding them, listen to them, understand, and know that these are far beyond financial transactions. I'll get into some examples here, but the first one was a legacy transaction, I would say. This is a property that was owned by a family since the 1800s. And here it is in, almost 100 years later. This is a while ago we did it, but the identity of the family was tied to this ranch. Their very soul and being, they were the ex-family from the ex-ranch. And at the end, while it was financially okay, and we walked them through it, every step of the way was like an emotional ripping of their tie to that property and their identity. And they found at the end, just to make it more clear, sure, they sold the property. It was the right thing to do. It was the best of the alternatives, but they could no longer say they were ex-family from the ex-ranch. And that meant a lot.
Just
So that's
about a minute left.
Okay, great. We'll wrap it. Couple of the slide on the beginning was the poppy bloom and Walker Canyon. That was with a sophisticated landowner. We helped them try and market the property on the open market. We split the property up into some of its highest and best uses. Some of it was commercial, fronting towards the freeway. The rest of it was difficult to develop. So we could understand the property and the landowner and bring together a conservation of what was Walker Canyon, that poppy bloom property now conserved. And we had a chance to work with Melanie closely in the Chino Hills. And here again, a landowner that acquired a property in a larger pool of assets that they purchased. They worked for years to try and do a sale of the property for maybe ranchettes or whatever. And the emphasis I want to make there from that learning experience was how Melanie could communicate with the government entities and the nonprofits that were not development supportive, while I could bring to the table my skill set with the development background and just learning that the languages needed to find a way to communicate. There are different terms and terminology that's vastly different. And the final one I mentioned is the Mojave Desert Ranch. We had ranchers that on leases with BLM that were running into conflicts with endangered species issues, and we approached BLM, the landowners, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, State Fish and Wildlife on what if we relinquish these ranches. Could we use that for mitigation for development projects? And they said, yeah, we like the idea of it, but that would take an act of Congress. Well, we went to Congress with the ranchers in their cowboy hats and talked to a few good people, and we got an act of Congress, and nobody said we couldn't do it, so we did it. So those are the kind of creative problem solving that comes to the table to make these. As Paolo says, they take a long time, takes a lot of effort. And I would say that in summary, takes patience, persistence, professionalism, and often prayer to pull these things together. So thank you, and I wish you a lot of success.
Thanks, Ed. We do have a couple of questions for you. Robin is asking a question about convincing a title owner or a developer how to consider more altruistic goals of conservation versus development.
Tough. I wouldn't use that language, just to start with. You know, it's the landowners you're mentioning are usually driven by a board of directors. They may have stockholders that they respond to, and it ultimately needs to relate to what is in their best financial interest. And so you need to bring to the table more than altruism. It needs to be efficiency of their other development approvals that would save them time. It might be a way of structuring open space conservation through using a land conservancy instead of funding the maintenance of that property through a homeowners association. It could be a tax benefit to some owners, not always, but that's another way to do it. So that's a short list of maybe how to look at it.
Excellent. And Dennis has another good question about kind of reality when a landowner thinks that the property can be developed, but it can't, based on site situations, policies, things like that. Any tips there?
Well, anybody going into the development business is an eternal optimist to get through it, and are probably very persistent. And there's a characteristic of domineering in the profile of many developers. So what I think works best on that is time. Time tells. And ultimately, the bottom line suggests that if they can't get infrastructure to the property, they can't develop, and that's a financial component. And so ultimately, it's a matter of their alternatives and how much time and interest and brain damage does it take for them to not develop this property and to move on to another property. That's sometimes ultimately that's the reinvestment of proceeds might be a motivator, that they intended to buy this property and hold it for appreciation and value. But if ultimately it cannot get a jump in value because of its approvals for development, its entitlements, approvals, and things like that, sometimes we're able to convince a landowner that, look, you're better off taking what you can on this investment and putting your money into something else where you can get the kind of returns you're looking for. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, that's really informative. Thank you. So we'll transition to our last presentation of this workshop, Terry Watt. She is, as I like to call her, an urban planner extraordinaire. She has got skill sets beyond anyone in the field, I'm sure. And she gets those of us in Orange County and elsewhere, myself included, in all sorts of conservation trouble where we have a lot of money to spend and properties to buy, and it's a 30-year commitment. So Terry, thank you for the good trouble, and I will let you tell us about some of your mechanisms for getting deals done.
Well, good morning. It's a complete pleasure to be on this panel, and I've enjoyed everyone's presentations. So I work corner to corner in the state of California, but let me back up and say, for those of you who didn't see Secretary Crowfoot's presentation on where we stand with 30 by 30 yesterday, please go to the recording. Maybe Gio can find it and put it in the link. I think most importantly, I heard what I believe coming from the Secretary Wade Crowfoot, which is 30 by 30 is just the beginning. And all of my life, I've worked on conserving the lands and waters that protect us as humans in California. And I think there's the throwdown. I think 30 by 30 is the moonshot. It's doable. We've put a person on the moon. I like to think that my presentation today is going to spark you to do some really creative thinking beyond mitigation, beyond normal courses of funding to achieve the Mars shot. Often I'm asked to work on the Mars shot, as some of you that I've worked with on the screen know. This comes down to someone's science-based and social justice-based vision and sifting through the strategies to make that a reality. So I'm going to talk about just a few of these. Innovative public policies, number one, negotiated agreements, which we've touched on a bit with Ed's presentation and Paolo's. And number two, and emerging and promising mechanisms. And of course, as everything I'm asked to speak on, this could be an all-day seminar, Melanie. All right, innovative public policies. We are moving into a new era. One of my planner friends always says, Terry, what have we not thought about that's coming on to the California landscape and presenting a challenge for achieving 30 by 30? And of course, the newest on the landscape is the dynamic duo of by right housing and frankly, by right clean energy, both of which I'm a big believer in and work to advocate as well. I personally think we can accommodate housing, the transition to clean energy, and the conservation of our waters and lands that preserve and protect us in harmony, not in conflict, but it's going to take a lot of work, starting with our general plans or local constitutions. These general plans can either present headwinds or tailwinds to your efforts to conserve land, and including urban greenscapes and our waters. There are only two jurisdictions I know of, and I would love for somebody to tell me there's another, that in the last 2 decades have basically rolled back what I consider to be unsafe, unaffordable, and unsmart planned development. San Jose, California showed tremendous leadership in 2021, changing its general plan that imagined urbanized a new community in the Coyote Valley just to the south between San Jose and Morgan Hill, about 7,000 acres. Approximately a third of that in the city of San Jose city limits and a little bit more in their sphere of influence, rolled back that general plan to instead designate that landscape as agriculture and conservation. I can't underscore how much that presents tailwinds then to the land saving action that is now conserved permanently about 1,500 acres and counting in the Coyote Valley through deals with landowners. LA County as well gets a shout out. They also get a shout out because in LA County's case, they just also adopted a wildlife district ordinance that I think is worth everybody looking into. But also last year in their general plan land use element and safety element, they put in wildfire policies. These policies basically say that beyond the existing communities, there shall be no upzoning and no new subdivisions. These are stunning, and our job is to read our general plans for our 58 counties and the cities we work in and see if we can import some of this thinking into the constitutions to create some tailwinds to our work. Next slide, and I'm going to move quickly through this one. What are some of the negotiated agreements? Let's just go into negotiated agreements. I think we skipped a slide, but that's fine. What are the outcomes we're mostly seeking in negotiated agreements? As Ed and Paolo and Nicole have talked about, land saving. There are hundreds of agreements I could have put on the screen. I'm touching on these because Newport Coast was really the first one that I ever worked on, and it put in my vocabulary, you know, what was an agreement with the developer codified in the plan, but that regardless of the cadence of the development projects, the land saving that occurred, which was about 80% of the Newport Coast, occurred regardless of the cadence and the success of the development. You know, we rolled that feature into a very creative negotiated agreement before there were specific development plans proposed on the 270,000 acre Tejon Ranch spanning LA to Kern counties. And that deal with the landowners resulted in protecting 90% or 240,000 acres through a series of other means. But I think one stunning example of this is there's no backsliding. Conservation, the conserved values on the lands protected must remain in place or get better. And those lands are all protected regardless of the cadence of the development. There's a cutoff when all of the land conservation easements are a done deal. I just want to briefly touch on the Irvine Laguna Wildlife Corridor, which is an also model wildlife corridor through the third most populated county in California, Orange County, an agreement with the landowner, 5 Points, and the city, codified in the general plan to build a dedicated wildlife corridor connecting the two NCCP areas. And these are just some examples of negotiated agreements with landowners that happened not with respect to the CEQA negotiation that Nicole talked about, but extracurricularly. So there are other kinds of negotiated agreements outcomes. Some of the ones I mentioned also have these features, which are other means of funding that flow into the protected lands. Like in the case of Tejon, there was an agreement for advanced funds to fund a new conservancy to oversee the conserved lands. But these are three other very interesting examples of philanthropic funds that were set up with landowner involvement around agreements. One in the Martis Valley that has generated over 20 million since 2009 to fund affordable housing, conservation, and restoration. One in the Los Cerritos wetlands in Long Beach, which is a philanthropic fund to fit into the ecosystem of other partners to accelerate protection and restoration of that wetlands array. And then a Swainson's Hawk Conservation Fund was set up in agreement with a solar project in Antelope Valley to first figure out what the Swainson Hawk territory was, how they operated in it, and what would be needed to permanently conserve that species in the landscape. You know, I'm going to turn in my last few minutes here to emerging and promising mechanisms, and I missed just a big one. So I'm going to start with community benefits agreements. You know, not only are the challenges to land and water conservation changing, but the opportunities as well. And so those of you who might know, we're working offshore, both to install wind power, clean energy to California, but we're also working to develop what would be, frankly, leading edge community benefits agreements. And I think a centerpiece of any good community benefit agreement is conservation. So to be continued. I told one of my colleagues this morning, it behooves us on the screen to write up a few more of these and spend some more time with you as you wish. But some other emerging things are transfer of development credits. A new project has just been funded by the state of California to look again at this creative means of conserving land through the transfer of development off of lands that have high value to infill areas that have lower conflict, thereby without purchase, creating a means of funding land conservation. I mentioned climate resilient credits and ESG. Corporations are more and more interested in what they can do to demonstrate to their owners and their stockholders how they're meeting economic and social and governance goals. This is beyond CEQA. I think we can translate what has been a lot written about ecosystem services on these landscapes into a funding source to protect these lands through the purchase of beyond CEQA climate resilience credits in California. And that's a program in its nascent stages. Advanced mitigation, over $600 billion is flowing in mitigation. We do not have our arms around on how to really strategically place that funding on the most important landscapes under the 30/30 program and beyond. And I think it behooves us to put our heads together to really figure out how advanced mitigation, pooling those funds and putting them on these landscapes that matter could really take off. It's a fraught situation. Caltrans, I think, is the leading edge of this with resource conservation investments plans bringing up the rear, but we have work to do. I'll just say one more thing. We got insurance companies not willing to insure in the most dangerous landscapes of California, and yet our public policies and our state legislation is not really willing yet to back that play. I personally think, again, we can accommodate housing, we can accommodate the transition to clean energy, and we can protect the lands and waters that will ultimately save us, those of us that have sprawled too much already. But it's going to take putting our heads together against, I think, this really wonderful program that is 30 by 30 and figuring more of this out. So I'll end by saying, think creatively, don't give up, have the vision, and pick up the phone. Thank you, Melanie.
All great tips. Thank you. So a couple questions directly for you. One came in by Claire about a property in eastern LA County in County Unincorporated Roland Heights, and the county's proposed downzoning it 2,200 acres down to 1 unit per 40 acres. So how does a landowner that is screaming about this, how do you convince them? What did San Jose do or others in terms of their downzoning models?
So San Jose basically played the safety card, but they were able to do that on the momentum of a huge coalition that included the conservancies, both the government, conservation, land trust, open space authority, and a private conservancy with a lot of NGOs, created a vision to protect Coyote Valley and convinced Mayor Sam Liccardo, one of my heroes, that we ought to look at this landscape differently against a climate emergency, and that putting people in harm's way made no sense. And there was not only a way to sort of transfer that planned development into San Jose, but a way to compensate the landowner accordingly. So it's very tricky, Claire, when you're both trying as a public policy to achieve a down planning to, protect the landscape and trying to create a conservation play. My suggestion is we talk more, and that the NGO community is particularly well positioned to help negotiate a final landing place here. I'm going to say the momentum of the proposed down planning is very good, and there is a deal here to be made.
Words I like to hear, that's for sure. Another question, what do you think is the most creative mechanism that's coming into the realm just now that didn't exist before?
Early stages, and of course we've all seen on the front page of the New York Times and elsewhere the negative comments against buying carbon offsets, carbon credits. But with the platforms that have been designed in the last few years, and some of the folks that are basically doing the validation of values, the multiple stack of values that a conserved property delivers, including carbon sequestration, but also flood attenuation, cleaner water. We are now able to sort of stack those, bundle them up, value them, validate them, track them over time, and package them, I believe, against conservation acquisition and restoration projects as a credit that corporations seeking to zero out all of their impacts and demonstrate that to their stockholders and potentially others. I think we're able to maybe in the next couple of years stand these up in California as a means to generate significantly more funding for land conservation.
Wow, well, that's exciting. I know Paulo and folks that do transactions will be excited to hear that, be on the cutting edge with you. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and finish up our slides. There's just a few left. So thanks to all of our presenters for your time today, for answering questions. We'll have about 13 minutes, I think, left. So put to the audience, put your questions in the Q&A and we will attempt to get to as many as we can. And in case you didn't know this, FHVP is hosting a series of webinars and each one occurs on the 4th Thursday from 10 to 11:30 with the exception of November, which is the 5th Thursday. And we will feature content related to 30 by 30 to help you and your organization achieve goals in alignment with the state's effort. Our July workshop focuses on 30 by 30 funding. So we're talking about the budget and the bond and all sorts of creative local mechanisms. You can take out your phone and scan the QR code with your camera and click on the link to register for the next event. The event information has also been added to the chat. We have speakers from the California Natural Resources Agency, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Earth Advocates, and the Trust for Public Land. So we hope to see you there. And if you'd like to be notified about future workshops, you can always email us at community@fhbp.org. Just provide your name and your email address and we'll add you to our list. I'd also encourage you to sign up for the state's 30 by 30 email list. That's on the screen now, and they provide content related to webinars, grants, programs, newsletters, comment opportunities, etc. And I'll stop sharing the screen and we will focus on some of the questions that remain in our Q&A. So Suzanne has a question and it might be appropriate for Paulo or Ed. Looks like Ed may be typing a response, but we can do it verbally, about a property that's already in escrow. Can somebody else jump in and provide another offer, or how do you avoid conflict that way?
So there's nothing wrong with if I understand the circumstance, there's nothing wrong with presenting another offer. It would be considered more technically a backup offer to the existing standing offer. And the owner of the property may be constrained by his existing agreement and his ability to modify his agreement, renegotiate his agreement. But it could also put on the table that should his existing agreement alter, that some of the performance from the buyer does not come through, it could be used to switch his angles on the purchase. It could also be used against the backup offer could be used just to negotiate tougher terms with the underlying offer. There's more to it than that, but Paulo?
Yeah, I think there's one thing you want to avoid legally, which is roughly called tortious interference in a real estate transaction. You cannot say that the existing offer is terrible for X, Y, and Z reasons, that if you take that offer, you're gonna, fall into X, Y, and Z problems. All you can do is say, this is what we propose. If, what you've got in front of you doesn't work out, then we'd love to talk. So you can provide, as Ed pointed out, rightfully a backup offer, but you cannot try to monkey wrench their existing offer, without getting into some legal issues.
And that probably brings up a follow-up question that I think is important to say. If you're using state or federal dollars, the government is not allowed to overspend. It can only use fair market value. So that offer, you should certainly be relying on experts in the field to craft an offer, as opposed to simply sending a letter. But you wouldn't want to throw out a number and hope that it could later be justified by an appraisal. Terry, there's another question for you in here about LA County, which is apparently a hot topic right now. They're proposing to eliminate any upzoning and restrictions in high fire zones. How would this work? Could it be challenged in the face of state law to overrule local zoning in certain situations?
Great question. And by the way, it's no upzoning, so no increase in density or intensity, and no subdivisions in very high wildfire. In high, it's a discourage. So the general plan is the local constitution. Concurrently, the County of LA brilliantly created a housing element that directed housing to meet their regional housing needs into areas that were not these. Thereby insulating themselves, I think, about the possibility that the state of California would have an opinion that by putting these restrictions in place, they would not meet their housing need. So I think it's a pretty durable policy, hasn't been challenged. I think the county is still working out what exactly they mean by that demarcation beyond existing community, which we're watching carefully. This, I think, puts in the vocabulary of some of us working on state legislation, the possibility that through state legislation, we would encourage this kind of policy in county general plans or cities that have got our wildlands. But I would be happy, Melanie, to get you links to that policy change so you can send it out with notes or put it in whatever materials you distribute after this.
Perfect. A follow-up question from Dennis, similar, talking about general plans. Because they can be amended, what do you need to do to follow up to add some permanence?
Well, right. Coyote Valley is a great example. We put the general plan amendment in the sandwich of speaking with the landowners to try to stand up conservation deals, proposed plan policies, and then following with other landowner deals, so that this strong signal for the city council, which gave unanimous support to the general plan change, was we have landowners willing to make a conservation deal at fair market value, and they're willing to actually support the general plan change. So that is very important to have landowners in the area, Claire, actually support the general plan change and or override it by going into some sort of permanent conservation agreement. But yeah, I mean, basically it gives you time and, again, tailwinds versus headwinds to do the land saving actions we talked about here today.
Great, thank you. Nicole, I have a question related to the endowment money for the properties you either manage or have a conservation easement on. Where's that money coming from? Because we know it's not bonds.
Yeah, so in mitigation transactions, the developer is provided the ability to develop their project because they are setting aside or acquiring a land for conservation. And as part of their requirement to do that, they have to provide funding for the endowment. So it's coming directly from the developer. That's how it's funded.
So that leads me back over to Ed then, and I'll encourage anyone else, since we have 6 more minutes in this webinar, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A. But Ed, what if no funding is available to do the transaction, and having done transactions before, that management dollars are required? So there's this lineup of order of operations and patience is required, but at what point do you have to say, trust us, we're really good at getting this done, and we know it may take a while, but oh, by the way, you're probably also going to have to contribute management dollars. How do you convince landowners that that's the right way to go?
We try and build it into the structure up front, with communication to them that, look, we're going to try and do it this way. And under these circumstances, an endowment may not be required. Say, for example, if it goes to a public or government entity, sometimes, for example, in San Diego parks, we've done this. But as a sort of setting the stage for the what if you're describing, if San Diego Parks, for in that instance, were not didn't want to take it on, it didn't fit their mission, we try and build into it a statement that the landowner may be obligated to fund an endowment so that they can complete the transaction. We try and build the parameters of what that might cost, but it's kind of like the appraisal. The transit we build in, it's subject to an agreeable appraisal, and we don't know what that appraisal is on the front end. So, and again, we state it may require an endowment under these circumstances, and we'll have to figure that out later. So it's that communication of the downside and that we might need to deal with it, but we're experienced in dealing with it, and they're not going to just get hosed if that does happen.
Understood, thank you. And heading over to Paulo, in terms of transactions, you've been in the business for a while. I've seen properties on a list that for 45 years before they get acquired. What can organizations expect in terms of the length of time that it takes to do these? What's the fastest you've seen? What's the slowest you've seen?
It kind of depends on what you're looking at. The fastest to kind of get to an agreement and close a transaction, I would say, is in the like 3-month range, and that is like light speed, right? Like that is just, you know, you're throwing everything at it, you're taking out loans on the faith that you're gonna, you know, pull together funding on the back end. The longest, again, kind of depends on what you would kind of consider the start. The end is certainly close of escrow, and you know the property is deed restricted and protected. You know, 5 years is not unreasonable for a very complicated project. 5 to 7 years. You know, if there are phases, I think like more on the like 5 to 7 year range. If it's just extremely complex, maybe 5 years. But some of those 5 to 7 year projects that I've mentioned started with land use battles and discussions 20 years before that. And so we're seeing a lot of those kind of come to fruition because there's not a lot of them left. And so they're kind of breaking one way or the other. But yeah, I think from like signing an agreement to close of escrow, I would say typical 18 months to 2 years, but you know, you can take more risk and speed it up, or you can, you know, take on more complexity and phase it and, you know, draw it out a little bit longer. And there are ways to keep landowners at the table, you know, by phasing it and closing so they get more cash, you know, deposits, loans, all that kind of stuff. So there's a multitude of ways to make it work.
Last year, I finished one that I worked on for 20 years.
Patience is a virtue that you have to have in this field. So this question from Dennis, who's apparently on fire today, asking all sorts of great questions. It's open to anyone. So which is better, more or less players, and on which side? For example, an NGO versus agency partnerships. Does anyone want to jump in on that one?
I'll take a stab. So it kind of depends on the structure, right? Like coalitions are great, having groups behind you in a kind of purely supportive effort is very positive. But then you kind of run into the old cooks in the kitchen analogy, which is you really do need to designate someone on point to negotiate with that landowner, with that title holder. There are going to be agreements that only pertain to the people that are signing on the dotted line. And if there's a perception that rights are being extended beyond that, I think you're gonna frankly run into legal problems. But less than that, it's just gonna be a lack of leadership. So there really, in a transaction, there does need to be somebody on point who is absorbing the risk, taking, the legal measures to, back up the funding, to be the recipient, to, be the person that basically drives it. But it's always great to have a lot of friends, but that takes management as well.
It's very similar, but my default is the fewer the better. You have a willing seller, you have a willing buyer, and you have the funding source. And beyond that, if others are at the table, it's because they should be there only because they have a need to be there.
Great advice. Well, at this point, we've hit our 11:30 mark. I want to thank our panelists again, thank the attendees for joining us. If Zoom is working correctly, you'll get directed to a survey, fill it out. It's pretty straightforward. We just want to know how we did so that we can improve for the next one. And we hope to see you in July. And at this point, we'll sign off. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Great. Appreciate it.
Thanks all.